So now let's look at the new blurs in Toon Boom Harmony 10.3. I've got my module library open here, and on the filters tab we have all our filters, and the blurs that we know already are directional, blur radial, and variable. So the new ones are box blur, Gaussian blur, and the radial zoom blur. So I'm going to drag the box blur into the network, and you see that we've got two ports at the top. I want to plug the artwork into the top right port. The left port, the top left port, is for a matte to which we can confine the effect. But if you don't want to confine the effect or cut it in any way, there's nothing. It's not necessary to plug anything into that top left port. So with that box blur selected, let's switch over to the camera view and have a look at the properties. So here are the properties for the box blur, and this is the chessboard artwork that I've got just to show the effect of these values as we update them. The first thing of interest is the blurriness value, the blurriness section with the radius value. I'll put in a value of 12 for that, and you can see that we've got a box blur. It's a very distinctly vertical and horizontal boxy kind of blur. The fall off rate here down at the bottom is set to 0 by default. If I increase that to say 3, we've got a smoother blur, but it has less of an effect. So if I increase the radius from this point, you can see we've got a very smooth blur. So the fall off rate will increase that smoothness of the blur. And if I turn that fall off rate down to 0 with a 66, then we've got the boxiness back, but it's a very, very blurry box. So I'll put that back to 12. Now the other thing that we want to look at here is the directional checkbox, and if I check that, we get to separate the length and the width of the blur, so the horizontal and the vertical blurring. So let's say I enter a higher value for the length and a low value for the width, and then we've got a longer, streakier blur in one direction. The direction of this is controlled by the angle field. So at the moment it's at 0, so it's horizontal. But if I put in, say, 45 degrees, we've got a 45-degree blur. It's doubly blur at the moment because we have the bidirectional checked. It's blurring in two directions, forward and back. If I uncheck that, it only has half the effect because it's only blurring in one direction, 45 degrees. So that's what that's for. And you'll find that these bidirectional angle values are in other blur types. So let's have a look at those now. Oh, before we do that, we need to have a look at the matte, which is the top left port of the box blur. So I've already prepared a matte, so I want to plug that into the composite instead of into the box blur just to show you what it looks like. And we'll go back to the camera view, and it's just a big letter A because, you know, A. Now if I go back and plug that into the top left port of the box blur and we go back to the camera, you can see that the blurring effect has been confined to that A. Incidentally, if you ever want to negate or invert that effect, use a negate module. Drag that in and plug it into the matte, and that inverts the effect. You will need to actually negate the color and the alpha. Don't worry about the bottom one, color clamp to alpha, just the first two checkboxes. And that will invert the effect. We'll switch back here and you can see that the blur is now only happening outside the matte instead of inside it. So now let's have a look at the Gaussian blur. I'll just put those aside, disconnect these ones. Actually, I'll leave the matte there, and drag the Gaussian blur into the network and plug that in once again into the top right port. The artwork goes into the top right port. If we switch over to the camera view, and we will enter a blurriness value once again. It's the same as entering the radius into the box blur. So if I enter the same value as we did with the box blur, value 12, you can see that the blur for the Gaussian blur is much smoother. It has a greater effect. So if I reduce that to say 4 or 2, we can see it's still a very smooth blur. even at low values. So if I increase it to something high like 66, it blurs into oblivion. So it's a very sensitive blur and very smooth and pleasant looking. Once again, we have the directional fields so that we can separate the horizontal from the vertical. And we also have an angle and the bidirectional checkbox. One thing we don't have in the Gaussian blur, because it's a very smooth blur, we don't have the fall off rate. So that's not necessary to use that. So I'll put in this, I'll uncheck directional, this value of 12, and I'll plug in the blur mat once again, just so you can see that in action. And if I switch back to here, you can see that the blur is only happening outside the mat. And I will just unnegate that, and there it is. It's confined to that letter A. Finally, let's have a look at the radial zoom blur, which is my favorite. The chessboard is being plugged once again into the top right port. We can use the mat, but let's not use that just yet. We'll switch over to the camera view and we'll play with these values in the layer properties. So skip down to the blurriness field, which is about halfway down, and if I enter a value of 12, and immediately the spin blur takes effect. I'm just going to skip down to near the bottom here and uncheck bidirectional, just so we've got it spinning in one direction rather than forward and back. So it's only spinning in one direction now with a blurriness of 12. The other thing of interest here is the directions section, where we've got a bunch of presets arranged as buttons. And these little icons are pretty self-explanatory, but the top one in the middle is a zoom blur, so I'm going to press that and see what happens. And right away we've got this interesting zoom effect. And this would be really cool for something like, say, a character falling towards the ground, and this is his point of view as he plummets towards like a road, something morbid like that. So that's the zoom blur, that's zooming in. And the zoom button at the bottom of these presets is a zoom out, or it looks like it's actually the other way around, as the icons suggest. But then we've got on the sides, we've got the spin blurs, left and right, or anti-clockwise and clockwise. And then in the corners, we've got these twist blurs that each are across between the zoom and the spin. So a twist is a zoom combined with a spin to give it that kind of spiraling effect. And the corners, the bottom corners are zooming out and the top corners are zooming in as they twist. So as you press these buttons, you'll also probably notice the custom field is updating. This value here can be animated, or you can enter your own custom values, but if I click the function curve, I can create my own values and transition between zoom and spin. So this also has a fall off field that we can change. So if I change that to 2, it has less effect, but it's a smoother blur. So I'll increase the blurriness to compensate for the lesser effect. And there we go. It's a smoother blur, but put it up to really high, and there we've got some really cool artwork. Now, one thing that you may be wondering is, how do we control the center of the blur? Because the pivot point is happening from the center of the screen at all times. But what if we want it to happen from the corner, or from, like, say, a character's shoulder or something, if you want his arm to spin? The way we do that is with I'll just reset this. Put that onto a fall off rate of that and zoom. Let's say we want to zoom in on this top corner. Instead of on the center, we want to zoom in on the top corner. So the Shift F11 shortcut will show controls. That's what we use to show controls for the pegs. You show the path or the trajectory of a peg. But here in the top of the camera view is the show control button. If you don't see that here, just right click and you can find the camera view tools there, and click that button or press Shift F11 and you'll get a little red dot. Using your transform tool or one of your advanced animation tools, hover over that little red dot and you'll see a little 4-way cursor, a little move icon. You can then drag that to anywhere that you want the effect to center on. So right now we've got the zoom centered on the oops, I selected the wrong thing. You need to have the radial blur selected when you're doing this. So select the radial blur, and that will give you access to this little control. So yes, it's centered on the top corner now, or you can move it down and center the effect anywhere else. It looks really cool with the spin effects as well. So the that's the center point for the spin effect. We're going back to the layer properties. The top section is dedicated to this little point. You can see the X and Y axis are values for their coordinates for where this little point is positioned. So you can also animate that as well, as indicated by the little function curve buttons. Finally, let's just switch over and change and add the blur matte. And if we switch back to the camera view, we can see that the blur has been confined to that matte. No surprise there. And by negating it, we reverse the effect. The other final thing just to mention is that there's a peg input, there's a peg port on the radial blur. So if I go to the Move tab of the module library, I can drag a peg into here and plug it into the blur, and that allows me to move that the blur center point around as well. So if I go back here, and I'm now moving the center point of the blur using the peg. And I could also attach the matte to that if I wanted to do that, just by simply attaching the matte to the peg in this way. So I just separate things there so it's a bit easier to read. Yes, like that, and then we can move things around together, move the matte and the center point, the spin point. So that's about it for the new blurs. Next up, we're going to look at practical examples for each of these. I prepared 3 examples here. The first one is a character swinging a rope dart, and I've used a spin blur on this bit of rope. And if I pause it, you can see that if I step through the frames, you can see that this is a spin blur that's centered on the hand, so that the end of the dart is kind of blurred more. And this helps to smooth in the gap between the frames. And a gap between frames causes strobing. If I just switch to the program and show you the file for this, the artwork, and I press play, you can see that this strobes quite badly, and traditionally we would fill in the gaps between the frames with a stretch or a smear drawing or dry brush. But with the spin blur, it's a little bit more realistic and it does the same job. Next up is this fan blade, which without the spin blur it strobes badly as well, and it even has that kind of realistic strobing backwards kind of effect that you always see in live action wheels and helicopter rotors and things like that. So a spin blur puts fills that in quite nicely and gives it some realism. The cool thing about this for me is that I can turn this over in 3D and add just a nice little helicopter. And I'm going to put a tail rotor on, and we've got the same thing going on there but just in 3D. And of course that looks really cool when it's rendered, as you can see here. The final example is a space warp. So this is just a ship in space, and I've applied a zoom blur, I'll scroll through the frames here, on the stars that takes place over 10 frames. So when the ship goes into warp, the stars blur into the background, and that's just an example of an animated zoom blur. So that wraps up the section on the blurs. In the next video we're going to talk about my favorite effects, turbulence.